I mean, we're recording it for.
Yeah, it actually is recording now. Hey everyone, welcome to another webinar with Alex Kautz, who is the head of product at Lincoln and does lots of things at Lincoln. Not only is he head of product, he's a good friend. He's an expert on the topic we're talking about today, which is user research and how to actually apply it to your organization.
User research?
Yeah.
I thought we were talking about JavaScript for beginners.
Oh yeah. So yeah, no React.
Okay.
Not Ruby on Rails. We're gonna do user research. So why don't you just tell us a little about user research and how people use it in the technology community?
Sure. So I basically spent my entire career in the Bay Area in civic tech startups. Aaron's got to go get the door. And one thing that you see consistently across every major tech company out there, be it Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, anyone you want to mention, is they have very well developed company functions for user experience design. They have entire departments dedicated to it. I was at Pinterest offices a couple weeks ago, and they basically have an entire department of about 20 to 40 people who just spend their entire life pulling insights from user groups, which then become strategic guidance and material that then the product team uses for strategic implementation and mocks and feature rollouts, product roadmaps, everything else. But they always start with user research. So no matter where you are, no matter what type of company you have, user research and understanding your users, either implicitly or explicitly, it's always the baseline for your entire company strategy. So I'm going to walk through in a little bit in a deck once we get started here that goes through a couple of tangible examples of this happening in addition to the benefits and how you actually do user research. So if you as your organization want to take this on and learn how to do it, we're actually going to show you how to do it today step by step.
So how long have you been actually practicing this skill?
Ooh,
probably at least 100 years, right?
Yeah, well, in Silicon Valley years.
You look kind of old. Yeah.
I'm Benjamin Buttoning.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've probably been doing this for about 10 years. 10 years ago was when I started my first kind of product-based service company, product-based/service company, where we use user research considerably. And at every single startup I've had since then, either ones I've started or companies I've worked at or advised, we've done the same type of stuff.
Okay. Within like the tech community and applying it to like tech startups, is there any like noticeable like stuff that you've done in the past where you were doing user research at a company and it completely changed the direction? Any like of tactical examples, practical examples?
Oh my God, yeah. So there's a bunch of those. So one is every company, every organization, every advocacy organization is built on a fundamental assumption about human behavior. That's every company. Facebook is I want to feel connected to people that aren't around me. Twitter is if I want people to create more content, I just make it easier for them to create content. Those are fundamental assumptions about user behavior, and those come from an innate understanding of what your audience actually wants or needs. So first of all, every company that I've ever seen is built on that. Now, whether the founders did an explicit user experience research study or they worked in a field where they gained that understanding ahead of time, it was the same basic understanding that built and scaled every major company that you use every day. I mean, I've worked at companies where user research has fundamentally changed the product roadmap. So we went from being a consumer-based application this is a company I was at, Rezu, where we basically did crowdfunding online for charities. We went from a consumer product that was meant for the masses of people finding charities they care about and then donating money to them to more of an enterprise level service tool where we had a more complex like giving day style tool. So we turned it into a company that basically did online telethon, so to speak, for raising money. And it was very successful. Onboarding and acquisition tool and engagement tool worked really well.
Yeah. One of the things that I've learned in the past from implementing and using user research is when Everlane was one of the companies I worked on before I joined Lincoln full time, and we learned that men and women shop differently. So we actually designed different product pages for the different genders. Men tend to be much more transactional, be very direct. They're not really interested in lots of photos. Versus women, they actually tend to be multi-tab shoppers. So they have your storefront open, and then they have like Google's images search open, and they have like maybe Instagram or something like that, YouTube, or they're actually doing their own research. So we adjusted the designs accordingly rather than having the same one for both, and conversion rate greatly increased whenever we did. that.
Oh yeah. I mean, look at any major product you say. Let's say you're buying, travel on kayak.com. If you look at kayak.com, let's say you use a VPN where you can actually like fool kayak into thinking you're in different places in the United States. Depending on where you are geographically, you'll see a very different version of their site. The things that they're pitching you on, the way that they sell you, the messaging, the site structure down to the UI can be different depending on what city you're coming from. So there's a lot. Most complex businesses that are mature are running many different types of versions of their site for different people depending on user cohorts or groups of users that they identified inside of their larger audience that indicate distinct usage or interest patterns. So check that out at some point. If you have a VPN, it's actually kind of cool. Kayak is a good one to mess around with. Airbnb is another that does a lot of this kind of stuff. And Facebook does it as well, probably more famously than anyone. They're actually showing different lower navigation elements in an app depending on who you are and what you've done in the past. So if I go to my Facebook app on my phone, at the bottom, I see like home, my profile, things like that. They're users that see completely different elements there based on things they've done in the past that make them more likely to do things in the future, which is a form of application of user experience research and understanding.
Well, I've recently read in the journal that Facebook now is testing an audio-based format for India because that's the main way that the people in India, they communicate. Like they don't really prefer having like a visual reading element because literacy isn't very high there, but they prefer like sharing audio messages. So now they're getting on buses and like saying, hey, what do you think about this? They actually first arrived with like visual prototypes, saying, hey, what do you think about this? And the people in India are like, I don't know what to do with this. But then they tried audio and they're like, oh, like this is how like I communicate. We send audio message. So also it's an easy way, which is really interesting, is that in India, because they don't have mass LTE across the nation, what they'll do is they'll save locally all the voice messages. And then when they cut to like a train station, then they'll then like use the free Wi-Fi to then upload all the audio messages at once. So it's sort of like it's like their like queue of like social things happening in their life that they share at once.
Very interesting. One last cool thing before we jump kind of into our content here, but if you have time later, go to a site called the Wayback Machine. You ever use this?
Yeah.
Wayback Machine is amazing. Basically what it does is it takes screenshots of major websites all the way back since the beginning of time, the beginning of the internet, and allows you to see what their site looked like way back. So I recommend you go back and see the iterations that a lot of major apps that you use on a daily basis have gone through. Look at Twitter, for God's sakes. Look at their logo. I don't know if you've ever seen Twitter's initial logo, but it's like a green, slimy, like drippy thing that says Twitter, and it's spelled weird, and it looks terrible. But over time, they evolved that, and you can actually see the evolution of their property, which is very instructive for understanding how user experience research and data changes a strategy over time.
So let's get into a practical example.
Cool.
So Alex is going to share. Hopefully, everyone can see it. Oh, infinite.
We just inceptioned ourselves.
Yeah, inception ourselves. So let's get started.
Great.
Yeah, so go ahead.
Awesome. So welcome everybody to our first webinar on user experience research. And you're going to see the statement here that user experience research is the key to every successful product or service in the history of capitalism, which is a pretty bold statement. But I'm going to back into that. So give me a second to fill that one in. But a little bit on me, we kind of talked about this before, but effectively I'm a Silicon Valley-based Bay Area kind of tech startup guy. And I've worked with a number of large brands and also small brands and startups, kind of helping them think through problems just like the ones we're about to talk about today. I've worked with organizations all the way from major media companies like Disney, ESPN, and ABC, where I train the executive teams in user experience research. So the same stuff that we're walking through today. In addition to a bunch of small companies, I've also taught this kind of stuff at large schools like Wharton, which is the business school at University of Pennsylvania, in addition to Pepperdine, where I currently teach a lot of this stuff to members of the public policy school, also General Assembly. I work and have advised numerous members of Congress. I think actually at this point it's closer to about 40 or 50. But I help their offices understand the value of understanding their constituents and what tools they can use to do that better. So a lot of the stuff you see today will be baking in insights from a lot of these big companies and an endless line of small companies and startups as well. So first, let's start off with the basics. User research. What is user research? Well, it's a study of user behaviors, needs, and motivations through observation techniques, task analysis, and other methodologies. So again, it is a way of seeking understanding for what your users want, what they're doing, why they do the things that they do. But really, a plain language definition is that it's a system of tools and practices for discovering and integrating empathy into your organization. For those of you listening on the call, be using Google Analytics or database style queries on a regular basis. But what that actually means is you are using quantified empathy. That's what Google Analytics and web analytics are for. You're trying to reconstruct the session of an average user because you can't sit next to them and watch them use your site on a regular basis. So it is a system of tools and practices used for discovering and integrating empathy. I think we may be stuck on a previous slide here.
No,
okay,
it's
good.
It's going, yeah.
Great. So here's a really interesting thing. So I wanted to talk about why we do this. So I don't know if anyone's heard of this, but there's an organization called Tihan Lax that if you're a UX designer, you've definitely heard of them because they create design tools for building better iPhone applications, in addition to web and Android applications as well. But what they did, and I think it was in the year 2001, was they created what's called a UX fund. So they basically invested $50,000 in, I believe it was these 10 companies that they believed exhibited strong UX and design principles in the way that they build products. And there's some ones in here that you think would be obvious. So Apple, Google, which now known as Alphabet, JetBlue, Netflix and Nike, also Progressive Corp or Progressive Insurance, Target, Yahoo, BlackBerry, although that one was a bit of a miss there, because I guess in 2001 things looked a little bit rosier for BlackBerry, and Electronic Arts. And what they found is to today, so this is actually to 2016, the returns in their portfolio outperformed the S&P. I think it was roughly 30 to 45% for an aggregate return of 503% on the $50,000 that they'd invested. So they walked away with $300 and change thousand for their $50,000 investment. The point here is that companies that are picked that specifically have a user focus in mind, that are very good at determining what their users want, researching them, and integrating that into their product strategy, outperform the average the average performance of companies in their space dramatically every single year, year over year. There's other studies that have been done similarly. There was one done by Motif Strategies that at a similar level. They actually found that the companies that they chose that had a focus on UX outperformed the S&P 219% over the course of 10 years. So it's something to be very aware of, that there are commercial ramifications for being very good at this. Now, if you're a nonprofit or an advocacy organization that doesn't have anything to do with commercial markets, it doesn't matter. The returns are similarly the same. I would recommend you look at organizations like Charity Water, who are largely regarded as being some of the most effective nonprofits out there because they're very good at understanding their users and optimizing for the channel through which they communicate with them. So the benefits here are massive commercially and also strategically. Another thing that I get asked a lot is, okay, well, user research, finding out what users want, well, when do I do it? Well, the answer is as early and as often as possible. What this chart here shows is that when you're early, let's just say you're starting a company or an advocacy organization, you have the highest amount of design alternatives you can go. You've never built anything. Everything is a weird mix of soft ideas. You can do whatever you want. The cost to change your mind is very little because you don't have an existing site or an existing app or structure or employees that you have to change to accommodate your new strategy. And over time, the number of design alternatives goes down because you've tried a bunch of different things and you get more locked in. And the cost to change your mind goes up incommensurately with that at the same rate. And what that means is over time, as I've built more things, as I've invested in more things, the cost to change those things, to conform to new ideas or new concepts increases over time. And I'm sure all of you have felt this. At the beginning, it's easy to change your mind. At the end, it seems impossible because you have to change the direction of the entire ship. So the goal is, and so this chart in and of itself does not just express the stage of company, but also the stage of particular strategy you have. If you're doing an end of the year giving campaign as an advocacy organization or charity or nonprofit, the cost to change your mind at the beginning as to how you want to do that is very cheap. It increases over time. So the point here is you want to do user research as much and as early and as often as possible. Now, there are tons of different types of user research, and we're going to focus in on one today that is actually the most important and most impactful, but you probably heard many of these before. There's quantitative data analysis, like we talked about before. Those are database queries or internal metrics reporting or Google Analytics. We're actually looking at hard numbers of how people interact with your content and changing your strategy accordingly. That is a type of user research. There's focus groups. Now, focus groups are something that you want to generally stay away from. They have fallen out of favor dramatically when it comes to user experience research design as a study. Steve Jobs was famously hated user or focus groups, primarily because when you get people in a room together, they tend to groupthink. Abilene paradox, however you want to call it, they tend to mimic each other's opinions or be affected by other people's opinions to the point where the data that you're looking to get becomes aberrated. So I never recommend any organization ever does focus groups, but you do see organizations still doing it. Sometimes they can be useful for usability testing, where you actually give people a task and have them walk through it and watch them navigate your app if you have an app or a website. There's surveys. Very, very difficult to do surveys well. The fact that you ask a question can aberrate results. The way that you ask the question, the wording, the sampling bias, meaning the people that get chosen to respond to them are the types of people who respond to surveys, which may not make them indicative of your larger audience. Surveys are very, very risky, and I would recommend you only use them for a small number of things, which we'll get into in a minute. There's usability testing that watches people actually walk through the app, like I mentioned before. There's A/B testing or single variate testing. These are tools like Optimizely or Google Optimize or Lean Plum or AppBoy. These are tools that help you change small elements of your site to see if you can materially affect conversion around certain things. So let's say I have a landing page that has a big button on it that says sign up for our email newsletter. I can change the color of that or the text of that or the placement of that. And according to that change, I can see how people interacted with the page differently. That allows me to optimize things. But I will tell you that I very rarely ever recommend early stage companies or advocacy organizations A/B test, because you're never going to optimize your way into product market fit, as they call it, or really solving a problem for your users. You're just polishing what you already have. You're not discovering new things as much. There's eye tracking software that tells you where users' eyes go on your page so you can see where their emphasis is and the types of things they click on, also called heat mapping. That can be very useful. There's my all-time second favorite type of testing, which is called 5-second testing, or pejoratively a moron in a hurry test, which basically means you're showing a user a landing page or a site for 5 seconds without giving them really much background to see if within 5 seconds they can understand the purpose of your site. This is leveraging the idea that people, when they're looking at your stuff online, or sometimes even in person, have a very short attention span because there's so many things competing for our attention today, that if you can't accurately communicate value within 5 seconds, it's very difficult for you to win that person over, especially for new uninitiated audience members. I love 5-second testing. I use it all the time. There's also card sorting. It's almost like, imagine like a psychiatrist, I don't know if it's a psychiatrist or psychologist, but they'd show Rorschach ink blot tests to somebody and say, what do you see here? What do you see here? This is the UX research version of that, where you have cards laid out on a table with different types of actions users want to take, and you have them rank them or move them around in relative distance to each other to show their affinity or level of importance for things. I've never actually used this, nor have I ever seen anyone use this, but I hear it talked about a lot, so I figured we covered a little bit. And then lastly, and what we're going to concentrate on today, the holy grail of user experience research is behavioral in-depth interviews. That is sitting down with a user and talking to them, asking them about their experience and having them tell you in their own words what they want, what they do, why they do it. And there's ways to get that type of information out of them that are responsible and effective and don't aberrate your data. We're going to tell you how to do that today. So one last thing to kind of show you here, because I think it's important to understand the different types of data research you can do. There's kind of two main axes. We added kind of a third bonus one here, but imagine that the type of data you can get is behavioral or attitudinal. Attitudinal being, how do you feel about this? Do you like this? On a scale from 1 to 10, how likely would you be to recommend us to a friend? It's called the Net Promoter Score, or the gold standard of customer service data. All the way up to behavioral, which is trying to figure out how people actually operate or do things. Now, attitudinal research can be very useful from a marketing perspective to tell whether or not your campaigns elicit a particular feeling in people. But as far as building products or building company strategy, they're not really that effective. What you want to be doing is behavioral research, figuring out what people are likely to do. Because, and I'll give you an example, I worked at, as I mentioned before, I was head of product and marketing at a company called Razoo, where we help people donate to charities online. We would ask folks, okay, let's just say, how likely are you to donate to charity this month? And they go, well, I'm definitely going to donate to charity this month. But then when it came down to actually doing it, less than 5% of the audience who said that they would actually do it ended up donating to charity of any kind at the end of the month when we reported on it. So people have a different view of themselves aspirationally and internally relative to what they're actually going to do. So as far as building functional product strategies, you want to stay far away from attitudinal research as possible, much more towards the behavioral side. Now, there's two other axes by which we split that, either generative research or evaluative research. Evaluative research is data analytics, and what you kind of see there with the quantitative axis there. So that may be me saying how people interact with the site that I currently have. Generative research is the opposite, where I'm actually trying to figure out what people are likely to do in an abstract scenario that may not exist. So particularly good for building new things or creating new strategies. So again, behavioral to attitudinal, generative to evaluative, qualitative to quantitative. We want to be pretty far in the direction of behavioral and generative and qualitative data when we're starting out. The earlier you are, the more you want to be in that top left-hand quadrant. The later you are, the more you want to get down towards the bottom right-hand side of the quadrant. So imagine as your company or organization matures, you're moving from the top left to the bottom right of this quadrant with the type of data that's most relevant to you on an operational basis. So now, what are we looking for when we do user research? So I wanted to throw this out because I find it particularly fascinating. I'm not sure how many people on the call actually use Reddit on a regular basis, but Reddit is now widely regarded as the front page of the internet, where a lot of breaking news starts first. So before, in many cases, it goes to Twitter, before it goes to CNN, MSN.com, all those other places you find it, a lot of times news will start on Reddit. They'll be broken on Reddit. In addition to memes and cultural movements that happen online, they all start on Reddit. Sometimes 4chan, sometimes Imgur, but Reddit is probably the top social community online. Now, when Reddit started, believe it or not, Reddit was pure NSFW content. And in reality, putting that a little bit less lightly, Reddit was mostly pornography. It was a very small group of people who had a very intense interest in pornography and wanted to share it amongst each other, or NSFW content, things that were inappropriate. And over time, what the founding team at Reddit found is that people who in these porn forums are basically talking about programming as well, because the folks that were using Reddit just happened to be computer scientists and were coding on a regular basis. So they split Reddit into NSFW and programming content. And for a while, almost a year, there was only those two forums. I could either talk about programming or I could do NSFW content. And then what they found is in these two forums, people were also talking about science. And then they added science as another subreddit, as it's called. So they had NSFW content, programming, and science. And this lasted for about the first year and a half of Reddit. And then they realized that inside of these three forums, people were also talking about politics, and they were sharing pictures and other things. So Reddit then subdivided Reddit again into these multiple other components, these subreddits, so to speak. So it was NSFW, programming, science, and politics. Then the real genius came out. What they found is that people were constructively misusing each one of these forums to talk about things that were unrelated to the subject for which that forum was designated. So in these politics forums, they were just sending ridiculous memes. They were doing WTF moments, like what the freak moments, or FML, or technology, or other things like that. So what the genius of Reddit is they gave users the ability to then create their own subreddits, and then Reddit exploded in traffic and complexity. So to review, users were constructively misusing the platform for uses other than it was originally intended to meet their needs. Now, another brilliant example of this is Twitter. Twitter did not invent the hashtag, but the hashtag has been the one product feature at Twitter responsible for more social density and growth than any other thing that Twitter has ever done. But the hashtag didn't come from Twitter. It came from one guy named Chris Messina, who is a PR guy living in LA, who used an internet forum practice hashtags that were very popular at the time because so indexing engines couldn't actively find things on large internet forums. People would go hashtag and then word, so that these wildfire search engines on these forum sites could actually find the thread of conversation they were looking to talk to. So he asked if people on Twitter in a tweet would like to use something like that. It took off like crazy. It took the product team at Twitter a year and a half to figure it out. Then they finally integrated into their product, and it was, again, the biggest feature they've ever released. So it's incumbent upon us as leaders of organizations to look for ways in which our products, our services, our tools are being constructively misused for a purpose other than intended by our audience, who is the only canonical source of truth for everything in our business. So one last example for constructive misuse, because I love this so much, is Slack. So some of you on the call may be using Slack. I can see Aaron's using Slack right now, not even paying attention to me. That's okay. Not gonna hurt my feelings. But
I'm always listening, Alex.
He's always listening. I almost believe it. I want to believe it. So Slack is a great example of this. Slack actually didn't start out as an enterprise messaging app. They started out as a never-ending video game. So when Slack started, their founders were like video game junkies. They wanted to have a video game that you could play for 30 years and then hand off to your kids and they could play, and so on and so forth. But what they found is that no one wanted to play a never-ending video game because people want to win video games. So you can't play a video game you're not going to win, which sucks. So what they did is they had built inside of the game a very well-articulated messaging feature. And they found that people were not playing the game, but they were sending messages to each other that had absolutely nothing to do with the game because the messaging feature was so well designed. And they thought, oh gosh, we've developed a game, but no one wants to play the game. They just want to use the messaging feature. Why don't we just build the messaging feature and pull that out as a separate app and redesign it? And they launched it and pivoted from a never-ending video game to an enterprise messaging service, all by looking for constructive misuse by listening to their users. So the question that Aaron asked before of like good examples of companies who changed themselves dramatically, these are 3 examples, Reddit, Slack, and Twitter, who dramatically changed the product that they were just because they listened to their users. And this same level of insight is available to all of us for every product that we have. The question is whether or not we're good at listening and whether we know how to do it and we're disciplined enough to do it regularly.
And how much is Slack worth now? Like 1.2 billion, 2
Yeah.
billion, something like that.
Multiple billions of dollars.
Yeah.
It's a Silicon Valley unicorn. So let's talk about how to do behavioral research and what are the steps that are involved in doing it. So now to back up for a second, what we're going to talk about here is how to do one-on-one user interviews, which is the baseline and the holy grail for all user research. So the first thing, and I'll kind of talk about this in background for a second, is I've been doing user research for years. I've been doing it at different companies, and I always felt that the best way to do it was to sit with somebody one-on-one in person, talk to them, read their body language, see what they're saying, and develop insights from that. And then when I was at Brigade, we hired someone named Indy Young, who wrote a book called Mental Models, which is a very interesting book. It's hard to get. I don't think it's in print anymore, but it's kind of a hallmark of every UX researcher's library. But her name is Indy Young, and it's called Mental Models, and we hired her as a research consultant at Brigade. Now, Brigade was a company, the idea was to become the Facebook, but for civic politics. So the social graph, but for your political identity, which is a very ambitious product that had never been tried before. So we hired Indy to help us think through our product strategy of how to launch something that people would actually want to use, because there weren't any examples in the private market of something like this ever working. So we paid Indy a bunch of money, brought her in, started this big research study. I told her about my methodology. I'm like, yeah, you sit down with someone one-on-one, you ask them very open-ended questions, you don't leave them, blah, blah, blah. And she goes, great, great, great. One huge problem. Never, ever, 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 ever interview people in person. Why? Well, God forbid that person finds you attractive. They're going to aberrate the results to try and impress you. God forbid they find you unattractive. They may be uninterested in talking to you. Not that everything's about attractiveness, but your physical presence dramatically affects the results that people are, the things they're willing to say to you or not willing to say to you. So the way that we did it at Brigade, and the way that I've done it every day since, is we have one-on-one user interviews that are done via phone, where we're asking people questions, and I'll get through how that works in a minute, and then we record their responses, we analyze that data, and then we develop recommendations based on it. So the first step in this whole process is to define hypothesis cohorts. So effectively what you want to do is start off a user research round by breaking your entire audience into thematic categories based on a factor. Now, it can be a behavioral factor, it can be demographics, it can be psychographics, it can be how much they use your tool. Are they a very engaged user? Are they a lightly engaged user? Because you want to make sure that you have somewhat equal representation of these different categories in your study, so you're not leaving anybody out. It just gives you a mental framework to make sure that you have a representative audience of who you're talking to. So at Brigade, we had 4 different levels of folks that we thought got engaged with political content. We had people at the bottom of the level, which were people that got involved with a specific issue for a specific period of time. Meaning there's a speed bump that I need to get put into my street because my kids play out there and people drive too fast and it's dangerous. I get civically involved by lobbying my local city council rep to get that speed bump put in. And when it's put in, I don't care anymore and I'm done with my civic engagement. So one particular issue for one specific period of time. Level 2 was a specific issue for an extended period of time. Maybe it's marijuana legalization. Maybe it's marriage equality. Maybe it's civil rights. Maybe it's whatever. But I'm involved with that particular issue for potentially years at a time or months and months and months at a time. It on goes. It's part of my identity. So that's level 2. Level 3 is I'm involved with multiple issues for multiple periods of time. It's my identity to be an activist. I am the person that you go to that's always got a different crowdfunding campaign going. I'm always having a party to raise awareness for something. I'm posting to Facebook. I'm the bleeding heart that's trying to fix the world. And then above that, level 4, the fourth and final level, were people that were professionals who had access to paid tools and a staff or professional intelligence of how to do civic interaction or advocacy on a regular basis. So 4 categories of Brigade. This is our theory. Bottom of the pyramid are people again engaged with one issue for a specific period of time. Second level is one issue for an extended period of time. Third level is multiple issues for multiple periods of time, a long period of time. And then fourth is professionals. So we broke our users up into those 4 categories so that we could make sure we were targeting ones that we thought would be the most likely customers of what we were willing to build. Now, because we were a pre-launch product, we did a lot more work to create a much more nuanced psychographic split of our user group, which I just explained. But at other companies, it may be much more simple. It may be we're looking for people who sell things on our site or people who buy things on our site. We're looking for people who are lowly engaged, middle engaged, high engaged. It may be people who are split on different age groups, depending on your product. We want people 18 to 35, 35 to 55, 55 plus. You have to pick a cohort that makes sense for you. But the whole point here is to develop these thematic categories to which you can pick specific groups of people so that you're not isolating too far into one group. You're trying to spread things out a little bit. It's just your starting point. So step one, define your hypothesis cohorts. Step two, pick a representative sample. So now that I've got my cohorts, I want to pick a sample that's representative of the audience to consider the following vectors. So like we talked about before, level of engagement is a great one. So here's a couple examples. Now, again, if I'm building something new for the first time, often when I'm doing a user research study, I'll pick those people at the top of the pyramid if I'm doing an engagement cohorting, people that are most engaged, because people that are most engaged tend to exhibit extreme versions of behaviors that you can then leverage for other people who are less engaged if you water that functionality down to speak to another audience. So the conclusions that I'm looking for are most concentrated in the people who are most engaged. So often I'll start with them if I'm doing multiple rounds. If I'm only doing one round, I'll pick a few people from each group. Now, a couple common methodologies for picking this list. So at Lincoln Deployed, as Aaron mentioned before, we have a consultancy where we do this for folks. But at Lincoln Deployed, there's one of several tactics that we use to typically find a representative sample. Again, tactics that you can use at your own organization. One is we may send a demographic survey to a list with one behavioral question. That's our most common thing. So if we're working with an advocacy organization that has a list, let's just say of 50,000 or 100,000 people, we'll cut off a group of them, a representative sample that's randomly picked of around 10,000 people. We may even start with their 10,000 most engaged users, send them a survey that's saying, please tell us your age, your name, your general area of where you live, or your zip code. We'll also ask one question about your behavior. So it could be, on a scale from 1 to 10, how engaged are you with this particular issue? And we'll pick people who fall into each one of those categories. Sometimes we do PPC or SEM campaigns if the client that we have doesn't actually have a large list. That means pay per click. So we'll do paid search ads in Google. Sometimes we'll use psychographic targeting with Facebook ads to find folks who are likely to be a good audience for a new or potential product that we're looking to consult on. But I will tell you there's a trade-off between each one of these: PPC, SEM, meaning pay-per-click, search engine marketing, Google style stuff, versus Facebook. PPC is great because users who click through search ads have intent. The reason they see an ad that you're placing in Google is because they've already searched for it, meaning they're already thinking about it. When you target users on Facebook, they don't have that same intent path. Users on Facebook are being targeted based on the likes that they have, the way they've constructed their page, and the type of content that Facebook has seen them interact with. So in that situation, they don't have an intent path. Facebook is just finding people who match a certain type of audience. So for instance, if we have an advocacy organization that is looking for conservative college-age students who are interested in tech, we can easily find those people on Facebook, but we're sending them ads without them being aware of who we are and not having any prior intent for finding out more information about our organization. With Google, it's the exact opposite. They have prior intent. They're searching for it. So there's positives and negatives to each, but it's good. Both are good ways to find folks if you don't have a list that you can harvest. Now, a couple other just words of caution here. You need to be very wary of selection and sampling biases. So what we talked about before, the way that we choose the list, let's say we're sending out that demographic survey to your email list to find folks for a study. We try and be very careful of selection and sampling bias. So we use the user cohorts to define types of users. So we're not selecting users based on our personal biases. We're doing it based on the cohorts we set up. We're also trying to send that survey out to as wide a group of people as possible to avoid sampling bias. Now, in some cases, we've done things like we put a pop-up survey that comes up on your website, and people answer that same survey, the demographic stuff, with one behavioral question in that form. But the problem is, depending on the type of page on your site that they may go to, that can create some very weird sampling bias. So for instance, one of our clients in the past was a media site. And on the media side of things, the type of users who come to your homepage are very different than the type of users who go direct to article pages. Most traffic for most media sites goes direct to an article page. So if I'm on CNN or ABC, 80% of their total site traffic are going to be going directly to an article page, not to a homepage. The people who go to the homepage are the ones who have likely bookmarked your site or are regular or much more engaged users. Whereas people that go direct to your article pages may be coming through a Facebook post or an email link or anything, or any type of area where they could have been served a recommendation for an article. So be wary of how you select users, where they're coming from, and how that bias can affect the group that you end up interviewing at the end. Because then if you're not wary of that, it can basically screw up your results before you even start talking to people. So now that we have our user cohorts, now that we've got a representative sample of our audience, either from our internal group or we found them through a couple of the channels we mentioned before, we have to schedule the calls. Now, this sounds like a pretty banal kind of part of the process, but believe it or not, a huge amount of operational overhead just comes to scheduling calls with people. And, in some cases we've had interns do it, but the truth is there's tools out there now that make it super easy to schedule meetings. And I would recommend you look at these if you're scheduling meetings with folks via calendars or emails on a regular basis. It just makes everything a lot easier. There's an app that we use called Mixmax that allows us to embed inside of an email different options a user can click to select a time which they're ready to do a call. Typically, we send them an email explaining what the call is, clearly communicating what it will be like, what you will talk about, how long it will take. Typically, user interviews take anywhere between 30 and 45 minutes. They rarely take an hour. We set that expectation. We say, we'd love to talk to you for 30 to 45 minutes. Here's the study. Here's a couple windows that are available. If one works, please feel free to click this and let us know. Once they click it, these tools take care of deduping things. So they make sure that people can't select the same thing twice. When one user selects a time, it ceases to be available for other users, and it's done dynamically, so it's great. So look into those tools for this. And lastly, we tend to incentivize in that same email when we explain, clearly communicate what the call will be about, that we'd like to follow up if we end up scheduling an interview with them with a $20 gift certificate to Amazon, just so that they feel that their time is well spent. We don't want to give them too much money that they're motivated by the financial payoff, but we want to give them enough that we create some goodwill and, again, make them more likely to talk and actually follow through with the call. So it's just a little bit of a carrot, not to be too much. Now, the beef. So now that we have created our user cohorts, we found a representative sample of our audience, and we sent out an email scheduling the calls. Now we have to actually conduct the calls. Now this is where the art comes in. But before we get into the art of it, let's talk a little bit about logistics. So one of the tools that we use internally is uberconference.com as a call utility. Now, we use this as an organization for all of our conference calls, but it's particularly well suited for user experience research because we can actually record calls ahead of time. And it makes it very easy for us to track them, also see who's online and when. And there's a beautiful web interface to just make it easy to see what's going on at any given time. So we highly recommend that. If you're going to dial into the call, we recommend that the person who's conducting the interview dial in at least 5 to 10 minutes ahead of the scheduled start time. If anybody else in the team is going to dial in, we also recommend that they dial in 5 to 10 minutes ahead of time so that there's no ding, as most conference call utilities have when they join. Because the worst thing is if you're talking to a user and you hear a bunch of people join the call, it makes it feel as though they don't know who they're talking to. They're less likely to be open and candid with their responses, and it tends to ruin interviews before they even start. Also, before the call starts, if you've dialed in, immediately mute yourself and other people to make sure that there's not embarrassing conversations that get told or get overheard by the user when they dial in. You never know when they're coming in. So just be safe and mute the call until they come in, then unmute once they join. And it'll be very obvious once they join. So a couple more logistics here. When you're talking to people as you're kicking off the call, always ask before recording a call. Never violate user trust or respondent expectation. Always give respondents the option to decline recording, never force it, and explain why recording is necessary. Typically, I'll say something to the effect of, hey, we really appreciate you spending the time to talk with us. We're looking forward to kind of getting into your experience of the organization today. Before we get started, I want to know, is it okay if I record the call just in case I miss something? I can go back and listen to it. These calls are super valuable to us, and we want to make sure we don't miss anything. We will never share the recordings of your call externally. It'll just be private for the company's use. And they go, okay, fine, that's great. I will say in my career, I've probably done a little over 1,000 user interviews. That conservative users, specifically politically, are much more likely to opt out of recording than liberal users, probably about 30 or 40% more likely. So if you're a conservative organization, imagine that may be the case. More people will opt out. Insert joke here about conservatives being not trusting of centralized authority. I think you can all probably fill that one in. Ha ha ha. Ha ha ha. Thank you, Aaron. Aaron's my laugh box for the day. After the call, make sure you download the audio file and upload it to a share drive so that other people can access it as well, or that you can access it and just track it. We often use SoundCloud, which is a great utility, actually used for people recording and disseminating music. But we use SoundCloud to track user research as well, which is great. So now let's get into how to actually do the interview. So when you're interviewing folks, it is not enough to just ask somebody questions. In many cases, asking people leading questions can ruin your user research before it even starts. The point of user research interviews, the skill and the muscle that you need to exercise and become amazing at, is active listening. It's not about you. It's not about your opinions. Very little, if any, of you as a person or your views or your interests should be represented in the call for any other reason than just the very narrow use case of making somebody feel comfortable and that their ideas are great. That's the only reason you should ever express affinity or judgment in the calls at all, only to encourage people. The goal of the call is to talk as little as possible. It should not be a conversation. If you are doing user interviews and it feels like you're having a conversation with the other person, you are not doing it correct. It should feel like the other person is on stage and they are feeling comfortable and wonderful and they're telling stories one after the other after the other. And the only role you have as an interview is to tease more content out of them. Now, part of what makes this difficult for people doing this the first time is they're like, well, if I really only want to know about this specific thing, like I should guide the conversation in that direction. That's a very dangerous thing to think and a very dangerous thing to do when you're doing user research. Here's an example. So at Brigade, we were very interested in how users used Facebook and how they shared political content on social media, because Brigade was founded by a bunch of ex-causes and kind of Facebook people that understood Facebook and virality very well. It was a focus of why the company was started. So when we started doing user research, we got a lot of pressure from folks on the team to ask them about how they use Facebook. Because in the first couple of interviews, we weren't hearing about Facebook at all. People weren't mentioning Facebook when we asked them how they consume political content or get involved with civic activities. Now, that's a conclusion in and of itself. If it's not at top of people's mind and it's not in their consideration set to talk about Facebook or talk about social media, I can ask them about it and they could tell me how they use it. But the fact that they didn't mention it in the first place is a conclusion in and of itself. It's not top of mind. It's not a focus for them. So be very wary of asking leading questions. Even the fact that you bring a subject up is a leading question in many cases. So the goal at the beginning of the call is to set up a very general question and then have them go deeply into it. So it could be something to the effect of, hey, like, great to speak with you, blah, 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 nicety, recording call, bing, okay, we're good. All right, great, let's get started. Can you just walk me through a time when you got politically engaged with an issue? That is a very vague, open-ended question. And some users may be weirded out by the fact that it's so vague and open-ended, but it's that way intentionally. If I ask them, tell me about a time when you got angry and incensed and like decided to do something politically, that automatically skews towards a certain emotion, which is very directional. I don't want to give them that direction. I want them to be as general as possible. So I'm teeing up a very open-ended question that I want that user to take in whatever direction they feel. I'm not leading the conversation. So once they get into their story, I can begin to direct things slightly by asking clarifying questions only. I never ask questions, I only ask clarifying questions. And if they don't take me down the road that I want to go ahead of time, which I should avoid wanting to go down a road ahead of time anyway, I'm not going to redirect the conversation in that direction. I'm only going to go deeper. Hey, a moment ago you mentioned this thing. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Hey, you said this word earlier. I found that really interesting. Can you elaborate on that thing? And ask a ton of clarifying questions. Seek out moments of strong emotion and specific detail. When people get specific about about anything they're talking about, it tends to communicate that there's an intense level of interest, even if they don't express it that way with their inflection and intonation. Specific details and strong emotions are the cues that we want to use to dial more deeply into things and ask clarifying questions. You need to develop your sense for what you think is important by watching those things very carefully. Pro tip. Now, this is something I learned from Indy Young, brilliant user researcher, behavioral cognitive therapist. She is absolutely a genius when it comes to this stuff. The first couple of times we did user research at Brigade, I listened to her talk, and what I found was amazing. She would get on the call, and she would do an incredibly effective job at making the other person feel comfortable. And what she did was she would shower them with positive reinforcement, even for banal points. If they're like, yeah, I got up this morning and ate a banana, you're like, oh my God, I love bananas. That is the most amazing fruit. Did you know bananas are like super healthy for you and high in potassium? That's incredible that you eat bananas. That's amazing. Every joke is 2 times funnier than it actually is. Every revelation is 2 times more revelatory. The user should feel like they're in the spotlight and everything is wonderful, that there's nothing that they can say that would turn you off. You cannot express judgment in any sense other than positive. Everything is amazing. When you do this consistently, when you react and show positive reinforcement for them engaging with you, you begin to get extremely honest and unguarded responses. It is amazing what people will say. You have people in your life, my girlfriend's like this, where she's like, oh, people just like tell me crazy personal things about their life. Well, the reason people do that with her is because she gives them a tremendous amount of positive reinforcement. She talks to them. She goes, oh, that she's very empathetic. She goes, oh, really interesting. Like, tell me more about that thing. And then they open up her and tell her crazy stuff. And at the end, she's like, why are these people telling me these incredibly personal things? Well, the answer is you did this. You made the respondent feel incredibly comfortable and rewarded all of their communication with you. It's an incredibly key ingredient to being good at user experience research. Now, I would say one more point on that. You don't want to go overboard. Obviously, I sounded very extreme with this, but if you go too far and you make it seem fake, people will pick up on that and they'll begin to shut down. So there is a delicate balance here. You don't want to act like you're faking it, but you do want to act very impressed and be very interested. You have to be and feel interested. So functionally, while I'm doing these interviews, I have a Google Doc open, typically a spreadsheet, and I'm typing up lines that people say, and I'm bolding things that I think are interesting so I can go back and ask for more clarifying points later. Often, if there's other people listening in on the call, I'll have them in the same Google Doc with me. That's why I use Google instead of Excel on my computer, where they can type notes and they can ask me questions through that. Because remember, in the call, they can't talk to me because then their user will hear it. They have to type that to me in that Google Doc, and then I can dial in. And sometimes it's helpful to have other people listening in the call because they may hear something you don't. If you're active listening, you may miss something because you're focused on a particular point of something that they said. It can be good to have other people listen in. So it's a useful tool to use Google Docs for that. Now, one of the biggest pro tips that I can give you, and this is actually true in all of human communication, not just user experience research, but even talking to people in your daily life, is you need to learn to love awkward silences. One of the biggest mistakes that interviewers make is feeling the need to fill every empty moment in conversation with something. The other person stops talking, they start talking, they say something, they clarify, they provide a bridge. That is a social coping mechanism that we all do all the time to make other people feel comfortable because silence feels awkward to us. But in user interviews, silence is a requisite component for getting honest answers. You need the silence. The silences are when the respondent is thinking. It is amazing what they will say if you just sit there and wait. I will sit there with 5-second silences in calls, which will be excruciating even for me who's done this 1,000+ times. And at the end of that 5 seconds, it is amazing the types of things users say. Now, not always, but frequently. You need to embrace that silence. It is crucial for getting good and thoughtful responses. Now, after we've done these interviews, after we've asked the general questions, all the clarifying questions, we've recorded them 30 to 45 minutes with each user, how do we know when we've done enough? Well, there's no easy answer for that. The real answer is whenever you start hearing the same stuff over and over again. If I'm interviewing users and I'm getting the same general thematic responses, I'm not hearing new things, or I'm just hearing slight modifications to existing answers that I've heard, it's time for me to stop. Maybe take a pause and maybe do another round in another month or another couple months. But at that point, I may have done enough. For most organizations we work with, somewhere between 7 and 12 people, you tend to start hearing the same thing over and over again if you're doing the same type of user cohorting in interviews. So about 7 to 12 is good to do. For most companies, I recommend you do this quarterly. So whenever we advise companies or do this as a consulting practice, we actually train their staff. We want them to actively participate in the process so that they can do it on their own after the engagement with us is done. Because we recommend, again, that they do it quarterly. Now, after I've done the interviews, after I've finished the number of interviews that I needed to do, what do? I need to start analyzing all that data. But now I have huge audio files and I have notes that I've taken. What do I do with them? Well, the first step is re-listen to all the recordings. That's why we record them. That's why we upload them to SoundCloud in a playlist. Take a couple hours and just sit down and listen to all of them. Take notes again, not on your existing notes from before, but a separate set of notes on everything that you hear. Because you've already heard it once, when you hear it a second time, you'll be listening to it with a new set of ears, a new set of conclusions. You will see things and feel things differently. Look for major themes. Things like common concerns, aspirational wishes, shared experiences, repeated turns of phrase are something that I commonly pull out because you can pull a lot out of that. Consistent emotional reactions, things like that. Then after you've done that, after you've listened to all of them, allow yourself to marinate on that content. Take a walk, take a long walk, take a couple days. Don't do analysis straight through like day, done. Give it a day or two where you're listening and reviewing responses, then take a day or two and just let it marinate in the back of your mind and then come back to it. It is amazing the type of processing that happens in your brain in the back of your head as opposed to in the front of your head. Very, very important. Allow yourself time to ingest and digest the data. Afterwards, begin to coalesce the data into thematic groups. So some researchers that I manage and have done this many times in the past will begin to take all those themes that I mentioned before and put them on sticky tabs and begin to group those themes into larger epic themes on a board and begin to draw conclusions and groupings based on that. That can be a very effective way at synthesizing all the data that you've gotten. What themes are recurring? Extend them to their logical maximum. So I'll give you an example. For one of our clients, again, a media site who spoke to primarily center of aisle, maybe slight libertarian leaning folks, as a media site that wrote articles, we commonly found in user interviews that after the election, many of the Republicans who were reading their content were actually not referring to themselves as Republicans because they were ashamed to call themselves Republicans. This social stigma for being a Republican after Trump kind of divided the country, or this election cycle divided the country so dramatically, there was a cost for them expressing that they're Republicans. And these were not folks who were not proud of their political beliefs, but the social cost of them expressing it was dramatic. And we began to see that over time. So we began to take that conclusion and explode it to its logical maximum. So if we are marketing it to a large number of people as a Republican establishment, that could alienate a large group of users who are not comfortable self-identifying as a Republican. So take themes like that and begin to group them and extend them to their logical maximum. Evaluate specific features of what you currently do through the lens of your new data. So saying, okay, now we have users that like this specific thing or do this specific thing. How does our homepage achieve that goal? Do our emails that go out on a regular basis do that thing well? And look at the delta between where you are and where you think you should be, then begin to make product recommendations that get you more in the direction of the conclusions that you're drawing from your user research. Because again, as I mentioned before, the only canonical source of truth for any organization is user research, is user data. So now that you have that truth, evaluate your site through the lens of that truth. Now, I will not lie to you here. This is a very difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of time. It takes you developing your taste. And that's the benefit of using an organization like us, of folks who've done it many times. We can help train you in how to do it. But that's not to say that you need us. Some people can do it without us. So give it a shot. See what happens. It's very, very useful. Now, kind of just in conclusion here. So we've gone through a lot of stuff today. We went through what user research is, the different types of user research, why it's important, the potential commercial benefits of doing user research on a regular basis. We also talked about how to do one-on-one user interviews, which are the holy grail and the basis for all the most important things when it comes to developing user inferences and data to develop product pipelines and strategies and all that good stuff. We walked through how to analyze the data and what to do with it, how to use it after that. This is kind of the first of many webinars that we'll be doing over the next couple months. We hope you enjoyed it and got some interesting data out of it. We're going to be doing a bunch of other topics later. I put my email address up here on the slide. This goes directly to me. If you have any questions about stuff we had here, or you want to find out more about the kind of things we do at Lincoln Deployed, we're more than happy to talk about that. If you have ideas for future webinars, we'd love to talk about that as well. Our entire goal as a 501c3 is to better serve our audience and help socialize the right types of best practices when it comes to product and company strategy and digital strategy, so we can build the movement, build the Liberty movement. So if you have any feedback or anything you'd like to see, please use us for that as well. So I hope this has been useful. I think Aaron may have a couple closing words, but I know we went through a lot of things really fast. So thank you guys for sticking through that. I hope it was useful.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, we'll be following up with the link to this webinar that you'll be able to share with your teammates, also the additional resources. In terms of Lincoln, things we have going on, if you're going to be at SBN, please come find us. We're on Wednesday night, we're hosting a reception, and we'll be releasing a scorecard on the open data initiatives that various states are doing. Also, if you are in the Bay Area, we are hosting Ajay Pai, talking about broadband access and across America. And there'll be lots of other interesting people there, including the former CEO of Google Fiber. And we'll be hosting that here in San Francisco in September. Check out our website, joinlincoln.org, as well as Alex mentioned, hire us at Deployed. Alex, you can actually work with this guy. Imagine that, right? Ooh. He could talk to you about this all day.
You just ruined it.
Yeah, it's over now. So yeah, reach out to us, Aaron at joinlincoln.org, Alex at joinlincoln.org. And Garrett is on the other side of the screen. He says hello as well. So thanks, everyone. Talk to y'all soon. Bye.